Nobody wanted the opera house. That was the whole reason he left it to her. At 71, 11 days after she buried her husband, Cora Rennick sat in a lawyer's office over the drugstore on the square in Cordell, Ohio, and listened to a stranger read out the division of 28 years of her life. When it was finished, Elias Rennick's son and daughter had the house on Bell Street, the brick shop on the square, the truck, and the money, and Cora had a dead theater on Water Street, with its doors boarded over and pigeons in its fly loft, and a note pinned to it, in the county's mind, that read condemned. Wade made a sound when the lawyer read that part, a short push of breath through the nose that in a warmer man might have passed for a laugh, and in Wade was only arithmetic, and Cora, who had not yet let herself cry anywhere the family could keep account of it, folded the deed into her handbag and thanked them, quietly, for the ride back into town. What none of them knew, not Wade, not Loretta, not the neighbors who shook their heads over the meanness of it, not Cora herself, standing that evening in the weeds on Water Street looking up at the boarded face of the place, was that the Cordell Opera House had not been silent for 30 years. The doors were shut. The music was not. To understand what that meant, and why a man would spend 3 decades of his life keeping the breath in a building that had not sold a ticket since before the moon landing was old news, you have to go back to a wet Tuesday in October, and a funeral that almost nobody in the county expected to be so poorly attended. Elias Rennick died at 79, in his chair, with the radio on, and the church held maybe 50 people. Cora had expected more. She had taught every child in that county their scales for 30 years and filled in at the organ at First Methodist for longer, and sitting in the second pew she did the thing she always did in a full room, which was count it, and the number came to 50, and it was not enough. Elias had tuned every church organ and parlor piano in 3 counties for 50 years. He had put his hands inside the instruments the whole valley made its griefs and joys on. And 50 people came. But that was Elias. He had been quiet the way a deep well is quiet. He did not join, did not run for anything, did not tell a story with himself in the middle of it. In 28 years of marriage, Cora had watched him say more to a rank of pipes than he ever said to a room of people. He had a 10th grade education and a tuner's ear, and he could stand in a church 3 blocks away and tell you which note on the organ had gone flat. The one thing anybody could ever quote him on was a line he said once a year in the fall on the first cold evening, standing in his shop with the door open and nobody but Cora to hear it. Nothing that ever sang is gone for good. You have only to give it breath. She had always taken it for what it sounded like, an old craftsman being tender about his trade, and never once thought to ask him what he meant. That was the shape of their marriage. She talked and he listened, and every so often he said a thing like that, and let it lie there in the room like a held note fading, and went back to work. The reading of the will was the following week. Sam Pruitt read it flat, the way a man reads a seed catalog, and Cora sat with her handbag in her lap and her back very straight, and understood by the second paragraph exactly what was being done to her. The house to Wade and Loretta, the shop on the square to Wade and Loretta, the truck to Wade. The accounts divided. 28 years and her own name did not appear until the 4th page, and when it did it was fastened to the one thing on that whole list that every soul in Cordell had spent a lifetime walking past without seeing. The Opera House on Water Street, Sam Pruitt read. The building and the lot it stands on, and everything that is inside it, whatever it may turn out to be. Nobody heard the last clause. Cora did not hear it either. Wade made his sound. Loretta kept her eyes on the lot. Sam Pruitt turned the page and went on to the disposition of a life insurance policy, and the moment passed over that room the way weather passes over a field, and the only person in the county who would have understood what had just been read out loud had been in the ground 11 days. Afterward, in the stairwell, Wade was almost kind about it, which was worse. He stood with his keys in his hand and told her, in the voice of a man doing a woman a favor, that he would take care of it. The building was a liability. Kids got in. If a cornice let go onto the sidewalk, it would be her name on the suit, not his. He knew a fellow who would pull it down for $8,000, less if they could save the brick, and the lot alone might bring a little from the bank next door for parking. "It's a fire trap, Cora," he said. Daddy was old. Daddy had gotten strange about that place at the end. Loretta said nothing, which is its own kind of vote, and Cora Rennick, who had spent 30 years being told by men in that exact tone which of her own opinions were worth keeping, said thank you, and said she would think on it, and drove home the long way, down Water Street, until she came to it, where it had stood her entire life, 3 stories of dark brick, its tall, arched windows boarded over with plywood gone gray as barnwood, the stone name panel above the doors chiseled blank, weeds waist-high against the foundation, a rusted marquee frame empty over the doors. It was, Cora thought, sitting there with the engine running, the ugliest thing she had ever been handed. She was 71. She had a room at her sister's and a pension that would keep a small apartment near the school, and, in point of plain fact, nowhere she had to be. And what she felt, looking up at that boarded face, was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but a flat, cold level clarity, which is what grief and anger make in a woman who was raised never to raise her voice. They had handed her the joke of the county. Fine, it was hers. She let herself in 3 days later through the alley door, the only one not nailed, and stood in the black warren behind the proscenium and breathed the place in. Dust and pigeon and dry rot and cold brick, and under all of it, faint and to her entirely unfamiliar in that ruin, the sharp, clean smell of machine oil and of something like a church on a winter morning. She did not know that was what she was smelling. Not yet. Her flashlight ran up over a fly system and a painted drop half off its batten and the gold-black cavern of an auditorium with its seats under canvas, and came to rest on the boards at the front of the stage, and she stood a while, because a woman who has sung in a choir loft her whole life knows the shape of a place built to carry sound. She moved in on a Thursday. It was not a decision so much as a string of small refusals. She did not call Wade back about the machine, and did not go look at the apartment by the school. She took her sister's spare cot, her own kettle that Wade's wife had already stickered, and the quilt off the bed she had shared with Elias for 28 years, and made a camp in the old box office off the lobby, a little room with a marble counter and a barred window. Her sister cried on the telephone and said, "Cora, you cannot live in a ticket booth." Cora said she was not living in it, she was cleaning it, and hung up, and stood a while with her hand flat on the cold marble, because she was in fact living in a ticket booth, and both of them knew it. She started the way she had always started anything, which was at the far corner with a bucket. The first week she did not let herself think about the will at all, or told herself she did not. She thought about plaster. The lobby ceiling had come down in sheets across 60 years, and Cora shoveled it into buckets and carried them down the alley to a trailer Roy Denny let her park behind his hardware store, one at a time, the way a woman works, who has spent a career on a hard floor and knows to the ounce how much of herself an hour costs. She found a swallow's nest in the chandelier and left it, and a roll of red-numbered tickets in a drawer, printed for a show in a year she had to hold to the window to read, and set them on the marble and did not throw them out. At night she ran a cord from Roy's alley outlet to a lamp and a hot plate and lay on the cot and listened to the building tick and settle. And twice she heard, back beyond the stage, a single low sound, not quite a note, more like a breath drawn and held and let go, and told herself it was the wind in a broken pane, and pulled the quilt up and did not go and look. She had never once, in 28 years, come here with him. That was the thing she kept arriving at, lying on a cot in her husband's dead theater. He came here. Not often, but regularly, the way other men went to the lodge, gone 2 or 3 hours of an evening and back with his hands smelling of oil and metal polish, saying only that he had been down to the hall. She had asked him once whether he wanted to open the place back up, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not read then, and could not read now, and said, "No, Cora," and now she understood she had been married 28 years to a man who let himself into a boarded building every few weeks to do a thing she had never once thought to ask about. The second week, the neighbor came. She was up on a stepladder in the lobby with a wire brush when she heard the alley door and turned, and there was Roy Denny standing in it with his cap in his hand, 76, who had run the hardware store next door since his own father died. A face like a dried apple, and a way of looking at a room before he looked at you. He did not offer his condolences right off. He looked at the lobby first, a long, careful look, the way a man looks at a job somebody else has taken over. "You're at it," he said. He always did keep it swept back there. He wouldn't have wanted it going to ruin out front. Cora came down off the ladder. She said the only thing she could think to say, which was, "Kept what swept." And Roy Denny looked at her the way you look at somebody who has asked what day of the week it is on a Sunday. "The hall," he said. "Elias, he was in and out of here 30 years, Ms. Rennick. You knew that." Cora stood there with the wire brush in her hand. She said she knew he came down here. She said she never knew what for. Roy turned his cap around in his hands one full time before he answered, and when he answered he did it mildly, looking at the ceiling and not at her, and he had no notion in the world that he was saying anything at all. "For the organ," he said. "What else?" "He'd run a cord off my back panel for the blower. We set it up years ago. And he'd come and give it a couple hours, and I'd hear it through the wall of an evening. That low one, you know the one, that long low note he'd hold to check his wind. Whole street used to hear it. The kids made up it was a ghost." He looked at her then, and something changed in his face. "You didn't know about the organ," he said. It was not quite a question. Cora said, "What organ, Roy?" and heard her own voice come out of her strange and level, because a part of her had already gone still, the way the air goes still before weather, and was waiting. And Roy Denny told her that her husband had, sometime back in the 90s, moved a pipe organ into the old opera house. A big one, a real one, out of pieces he'd hauled home for years, and had been building it and keeping it in tune ever since, alone, in the dark, behind the stage, in a building the whole town believed was empty. That he, Roy, had let him run the power for it, and never charged him a dime, and never once asked him why. Because Elias Rennick was a man you did not ask, and a man is entitled to a thing that is his own. That he had heard it 1,000 times through the party wall, and never in 30 years set foot in to see it, because he had not been asked. "An organ don't keep itself in tune," he said. He put his cap back on. Somebody was in there loving that thing. Cora stood in the wrecked lobby a long time after the door closed behind him. 30 years. A low-held note the whole of Water Street had heard on still evenings and folded into a joke, a ghost in the old opera house, and never once wondered whose breath it was. She looked through the doors into the black cave of the auditorium, at the pale proscenium arch and the dark behind it where the stage was, and even across 100 feet of shrouded seats she felt the pull of it now, the way you feel a held note in your chest before your ear has caught it. She did not go back that night. She went to the county building the next morning, because there was arithmetic to be done, and Cora Rennick did her thinking with numbers the way Elias had done his with sound. A building does not sit on a courthouse square for 50 years unpaid. She knew what happens to a lot nobody pays the taxes on. The county takes it and sells it, and the wrecking crew comes. And the opera house was still standing. so somebody had been paying. The clerk pulled the parcel history, 9 pages, and Cora sat on a bench in the hall and read it, and the room went very quiet around her. The taxes on the Opera House had been paid every single year without a lapse, in the fall, in cash, at the window, for 30 years, by Elias Rennick, on a building that stood in his name and that he never once told his wife or his children he owned. The delinquency that would have taken it in the black 80s had been cured. All of it, the year he bought it. And clipped to the back of the file was a note in a former treasurer's hand. Fire insurance current, premiums PD by owner do not send to sale. She did the sum on the back of the parcel printout because she had to put it somewhere. 30 years of taxes and premiums on 3 stories of downtown brick came to something over $11,000, spent quietly, in cash, one autumn at a time, by a man who bought his work pants at the farm store, to keep the county from tearing down a building that every last person in it, including his own son, including his own wife, had agreed for 30 years was worth nothing at all. Do not send to sale. That evening she went back to Water Street and did not stop in the lobby. She went down the side aisle of the dark auditorium with her flashlight, up the little steps at the side of the stage, and out onto the boards, and turned the beam upstage, past the fallen drop, into the deep of it behind the proscenium where the town had believed for 50 years there was nothing but rope and shadow. And the light found a wall that should not have been there. Somebody had framed and closed off the entire back third of the stage house, floor to grid, a partition of new studs and plywood painted flat black to disappear into the theater dark, and set into it, dead center, facing the empty seats, was a door. A plain door, fitted true, and on it a hasp, and the hasp was brass, and it was clean, and its screws were bright, and there was not one other bright screw in that entire building. Everything at the Opera House was 50 years dead. The plaster was down, the seats rotted under their canvas, and here, behind the stage, where no one in the county had any reason ever to walk, was a padlock a man had put up within the last few years. A man who bought his work pants at the farm store. She went through Elias's key ring twice, standing there on the stage in the dark. 50 years of keys, shop keys and church keys and keys to instruments and cases and buildings all over 3 counties, and not one of them fit that lock. That night, she went at his papers. She had one cardboard box of them, carried out of the house on Bell Street the afternoon before Wade's wife came through with her stickers. And now, she sat on the cot under the lamp and went through her husband's paper the way she had gone at the plaster, expecting nothing. Tax paper, the truck title, his draft card, a 10th grade report card with a failing mark in deportment that made her laugh out loud, alone, in a dead building, at 11 at night. And at the bottom, in a manila folder soft as cloth, a sheaf of receipts, and she looked at the top one a long while before she understood it. And then, she understood it, and went still. They were salvage receipts. Bills of sale, 30 years of them, for the guts of pipe organs sold off cheap out of churches all over the valley as the churches came down. A 3-rank Esty out of a Baptist church in Vinton, $40. Reed stops out of a Lutheran church in the next county, hauled for the taking. A blower. A console. Rank after rank of pipes, some paid for in 10s and 20s, most of them free for the carrying. Because when a country church dies, the last thing anybody wants is the organ. Too big to move and too holy to junk, and so mostly it goes to the dump. Elias had spent 30 years driving to those churches and carrying their voices home. And at the bottom of the folder, the oldest receipt of all, the paper gone brown and soft and folded so many times it had worn through at the creases, was a bill of sale dated the winter of 1975 from a salvage lot in a town Cora had not let herself say out loud in 50 years, for one pipe organ, tracker action, Maker's Plate Volmer and Sons Cincinnati 1874, removed from the Amsden Methodist Church, $45. Cora sat on the cot with that paper in her 2 hands and could not get her breath. Amsden was under 200 feet of water. It had been a town, a real one, a river town in a bottom 9 miles up the valley, 40 houses and a store and a school, and the white-frame Methodist church her grandfather helped raise, and in the winter she was 13 the Army engineers finished the dam at the Narrows, and the water came up over all of it. Slow, over a whole autumn, and the people of Amsden were paid and scattered to Columbus and Chillicothe and the far side of the county, and where the town had stood there was a reservoir now, with a boat ramp and a sign and no marker and nothing, and Cora Larkin had been one of the children carried out of it. She had learned to play on the Amsden organ. On the Volmer, her grandfather, Amos Larkin, had given the church its finest rank of pipes the year his own wife died, the open diapason. The big singing 8-foot stops down the middle that Cora as a girl thought was the actual sound of God, and stood behind her and counted while she found the notes. And in the last summer, the water was coming. The men had taken the organ out before the flood so it would not drown, and sold it for what they could get, and Cora, 13, had believed for 58 years that it was gone the way Amsden was gone. Into the water, into the past, into the place things do not come back from. Her husband had bought it for $45 the winter she turned 20. 23 years before he ever laid eyes on her. She read the receipt until she could not see it anymore, and then she put her face down into her husband's folded shirt that still smelled of him and of oil, and for the first time since the funeral, alone, with nobody and 3 stories of brick to keep account of it, Cora Rennick wept. And she could not have told anybody whether it was grief or fury or something, with no name at all, and it was all 3. He had left her something. She did not yet know the whole of what it was. But he had spent 30 years and $11,000 and the better part of a dying craft, making sure it would still be standing on the day she came looking. The key was in the shop. She should have known it would be. Elias kept the key to a thing with the thing it belonged to, always, and so the next morning she drove to the brick shop on the square that now belonged to Wade, and let herself in with the ring while it was still hers to do, and went to the workbench where her husband had sat for 50 years, and taped up under the lip of it. Where a hand would go looking and an eye would not, wrapped in a scrap of the chamois he used on pipe metal, was a small brass key, newer than anything else in that room, and folded around it, a card. An index card. Soft pencil. Block capitals, drawn slow and square by a man who did everything slow and square. It was not a drawing this time. It was 4 words and her name. Give her breath, Cora. She held it a long moment, because she understood by then that he had known. That he had known for years. That every silence of his had been full. And she put the key in her pocket and drove back to Water Street and went down the dark aisle and up onto the stage and put the little brass key into the bright brass lock, and it turned on the first try. Smooth. Oiled, the way a lock turns when a man has been keeping it that way for a reason. She pulled the door. And the smell came out at her, not the ruined smell of the rest of the building. Cool and dry and clean, and full of oil and leather and metal and old wood, the smell she had breathed in the doorway that first day and not known, the smell of the inside of an instrument, and under it, faint and impossible and 58 years gone, the particular smell of the Amsden church. She found a switch. She had gotten good, by then, at finding switches in her husband's buildings. Work lights came up down the length of a room that ran the whole back of the stage house, 30 feet deep and 3 stories to the grid. And it was. And this was the thing that put her hand against the doorframe. Warm. Not warm like summer. Warm and dry like a room somebody keeps. In a building where the wife had spent 2 weeks in a coat, one room had a little sealed gas heater ticking in the corner and a humidifier beside it, and the air in it sat where an instrument wants it. and Cora would learn later that her husband had chased the damp out of this one room for 30 years, the way another man tends a fire. And rising up out of the middle of it, up into the dark toward the grid, rank on rank on rank, was the organ. It stood on a great oak case her husband had built, and it climbed the height of 2 men and more, and its face was a rising city of pipes. Wood and burnished metal, the big square wooden bases at the outside going up to pipes no longer than a finger in the middle. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every one plumb and dusted and true, and the whole of it caught the work light and threw it back soft and gold, and Cora Rennick stood on the stage of a dead theater and looked at the most beautiful thing she had ever seen standing in a room the whole world believed was empty. She did not count the pipes that night. Dr. Vogel counted them 9 weeks later, with a clipboard and a flashlight and 2 days, and the number came to 1,342 in 22 ranks, on 2 manuals and a pedal. At the foot of it, built into the case, was the console. 2 keyboards, yellowed ivory worn hollow in the middle where hands go. A rank of stop knobs down each side with their names hand-lettered on porcelain faces, and a rail of pedals, and a bench. And squared on the music rack, exactly centered, waiting, was a book. Canvas-covered, the size of a ledger, its spine lettered by hand in that same soft pencil, voicing. Cora sat down on her husband's bench, on the bench, and opened his book, and what was in it was 30 years of a man's handwriting, and it read like a tuner's work log, and it was not a work log. Every page was a grid he had ruled himself with a straightedge. Rank, pitch, the date he set it, the church it came out of, and then a column he had headed, in his block capitals, note, and in that column 1 line to a rank, in pencil, for 30 years. Solitional, out of Zion at Vinton. The whole church sang under this one for 90 years. Kept it. Stopped Diapason, the Lutherans, next county. Sweetest wood I ever had in my hands. They were going to burn it for the copper in the blower. Vox Humana, from the funeral chapel on the pike. Cracked voiced her true again. Somebody's mother is in this sound, and at the end of every entry, the same terse bearing, the way a man notes where a thing is set. A division, a position, a note. Great. 3rd, middle C swell. Bass end. He had saved the voices of a whole valley of dead churches, and then he had built a finding aid for them, because a voice you cannot find again is a voice you did not truly save. Cora turned back through the book to the front, to the first ruled page, to entry number 1. And entry number 1 was not a church in the next county. It was closer than that, and further away, and it was written in a hand a little younger and a little less steady than the rest. 30 years less worn. Open diapason, 8 foot, and 12 wood basses. Volmer, 1874, out of Amsden, before the water. The best rank in this valley or any other. This is the one the whole thing is built around. And under it, in the note column, in pencil, the Larkin pipes. A. Larkin gave them the year his wife died. A girl learned to play on this. Did not know her yet. Cora read it 4 times. In the winter of 1975, she had been 20 years old and 1,000 miles into her own leaving. A girl who had gotten out of a drowned valley and did not mean to look back. She had not met Elias until she was 43, when she came home to teach and to bury her father and stayed, and he came to tune the school piano and asked her, in the hallway, what she thought of the temperament he had set it in. And she told him. And he smiled for the first time she ever saw. 23 years before that hallway, a young man she had never heard of had paid $45 for the drowned church of a girl he had not met, and written this line about it, and the line was in the front of a book on the rack of an organ in a room he had heated for 30 years. Bearing, great, center, the whole face. She did not need the bearing. The Larkin pipes were the tall singing rank down the very middle of the face, the sound a girl of 9 thought was God. They had been standing 8 feet in front of her the whole time, and tucked into the bench, under the spare music, wrapped in a plastic sleeve her husband had sealed with tape, was a hymnal. It was small and old, its cover worn soft, its spine mended with cloth tape gone brittle, and Cora knew it before she had it out of the sleeve, knew it in her hands before her eyes would say it, because she had carried it under her arm every Sunday of her childhood and left it in the bench of the Amsden organ the last summer. The summer of the water. A girl of 13 who did not understand that when they took the organ out they would take the bench and everything in it, and who had grieved that lost hymnal for a year, the way you grieve a small thing when you are not allowed to grieve the large one. Inside the cover, in a round, careful child's pencil, Cora Larkin, Amsden, and under it, in the same hand, her whole self at 11. Please return. He had had it 51 years. He had found it in the bench in 1975, not knowing who she was, and kept it because you do not throw away a child's hymnal you find in a bench, and then one day, years into their marriage, he had opened that bench and read that name, and understood what he was holding, and whose drowned church stood in a room he heated on Water Street. And he had said nothing. He had only sealed the hymnal against the damp, and gone on giving the thing breath, and left it on the rack for the day his wife would sit down and find her own name in her own child's hand. Please return. 58 years after she wrote it. It was open, weighted flat with a strip of lead, to a page she did not have to read the number of, because a woman who filled in at the organ for 30 years knows every hymn by its shape on the staff, and this was the one about the river, the one they had sung in Amsden the last Sunday before the water, in the emptied church where the organ was already gone, every voice bare and shaking in a room that would be under the lake by spring. Shall we gather at the river? It took her the better part of an hour to raise the wind. Her hands did not know the sequence of the blower and the switches, and she got it wrong twice and said a word she had not said out loud since her father was alive, and then a low hum built below the floor and climbed and steadied, and became the sound Roy Denny had heard through the party wall for 30 years, the held note. The ghost of the Cordell Opera House, and it was not a ghost. It was wind in a reservoir of leather her husband had made airtight with his own hands, waiting to be spent. She set her feet on the pedals. She drew the Larkin pipes, the open diapason, the center of the face, the stop knob worn most of all, because it was the one he pulled to check his life's work, and its porcelain face set in her husband's tiny lettering diapason, and under that, so small she had to lean to read it, Larkin. And Cora Rennick put her hands down on the keys of the drowned Church of Amsden, on the pipes her grandfather gave the year his wife died, in the last hour of a dead theater on Water Street, and played Shall We Gather at the River. And the sound that came up out of the floor and filled the stagehouse and rolled out over 100 shrouded seats in the dark was the sound she had thought the water took when she was 13, whole and warm and enormous and alive. She played it 11 times. Somewhere around the 6th she understood she was not playing it for herself, and never had been. When she could, she turned the voicing book to the last page that had writing on it, because she knew a man who kept a hymnal for 51 years does not forget the last verse. The last page was not a grid. It was 4 lines of pencil. It's the organ. Cora, it was always the organ. I bought your church for $45 before I ever knew your name, and I did not understand for 20 years what I had been carrying. When I opened the bench and read Please Return, I sat in this room a whole night. I never could think how to say it out loud, so I built it instead. Give her breath, and play the Larkin Stop, and you will have Amsden back, which is the only place I could ever get for you. Nothing that ever sang is gone for good. You have only to give it breath. She called Josie, because Josie was the only one of them who had wept at the funeral. Loretta's girl, 22, sang alto in the community chorus, and Cora had always thought, more of her grandfather in her than either of the two who carried his blood by the pint. Josie came down on a Sunday expecting to help clear plaster, and Cora walked her up the dark aisle and onto the stage and turned the brass key and let the warm-oiled air roll out. Josie Coyle stood in that doorway about 6 seconds, then put her hand over her mouth, which Cora would remember, because Josie always had something to say, and for once, said nothing. "Nana," she said finally, "do you know what this is?" Cora said she was hoping somebody was going to tell her. Josie was the one who found Dr. Miriam Vogel, because Josie was 22, and it took her one evening with her phone. Vogel curated the historic instrument collection at the conservatory 2 hours north and drove the state for the Organ Society besides, cataloging what was left. And she came down out of professional duty and low expectation, and said afterward that she had written the letter in her head on the way, the kind one she wrote a dozen times a year. "We are so sorry, but the instrument you describe has almost certainly deteriorated past the point of restoration." Because that is what happens. An organ left in an unheated building does not last. The leather of its bellows dries and cracks, and it will no longer hold wind. The wooden pipes split. The soft metal ones slump and collapse of their own weight. A slow lead sickness, and there is no colder, damper thing in the world than a closed theater in an Ohio river valley in February. Vogel had learned to expect a corpse. She walked into a room that was warm and dry and smelled of oil, and stopped in the middle of the floor and stood there so long that Josie asked her if she was all right. She did the leather first, going around the instrument pressing a bellows corner between her fingers to feel whether it had gone to cardboard, making a small sound in her throat. And then she asked Cora to raise the wind, and stood in front of the open diapason with her eyes shut and listened to one note for a long time, and when she opened her eyes they were wet, and she was a hard woman, Cora could tell, not given to it. She spent 2 days. She counted every pipe and read the whole voicing book from the stool and matched it against the ranks, great third middle C, swell bass end, and every entry matched. A dead man's word and a dead man's work agreeing with each other in a heated room in the dark. Then she sat down by Cora in the front row and told her what she had. She said the core of it, the Vollmer, 1874, was one of perhaps 9 instruments left in the country by that Cincinnati house, and the only one she knew of still on its original tracker action, and still speaking. The open diapason, the Larkin rank, was as fine a piece of 19th century voicing as she had put her ear to in 30 years in the field. And the 21 ranks he had gathered from the dead churches of the valley and voiced to stand beside the Vollmer without once overpowering it were the work of a master, she used the word plainly. And she could name on one hand the living builders who could have done it, and none of them had a 10th grade education. Then she said the thing Cora would hear repeated back to her, in one form or another, for the rest of her life, in the paper and in a courtroom, and 2 years on in a lecture hall at the conservatory, where Cora sat in the front row in a good dress and did not follow the second half of it. Vogel said, "I work for an institution that let a Roosevelt organ rot in a chapel because we could not find $8,000 a year to heat the room. Your husband had a 10th grade education, a gas heater, a hardware store humidistat, and a book. He held this instrument at a temperature and humidity a conservatory would envy for 30 years, alone, without one lapse. And he did it on the taxes your family laughed at. There are 3 institutions in this country that could not have preserved what is standing in that room. The reason it is alive is the man they told you was getting strange." Then she asked what was on it, and Cora did not understand the question, and Vogel said it another way. She said, "Whose churches are these?" And that is where the story stops being only about Cora Rennick. Because they were the valleys. All of them. 22 ranks out of a dozen dead congregations. Zion at Vinton and the Lutherans, and the funeral chapel on the Pike, and the Baptists whose building was a self-storage now, and the Little Aim Church whose whole membership had moved to the city one family at a time until there was no one left to unlock the door. Every one of them a church that no longer existed. A people scattered, a Sunday sound gone out of the world, and Elias had driven to each one as it died, and carried its voice home, and set it breathing again in a room on Water Street, so that when it played, the whole vanished worship of a county played, all at once, out of one throat. And Amsden at the center of it. Verley Cade was 84, and had not heard the Amsden organ since she was a young woman carrying her first baby out of a church the water was coming for. Josie drove out and got her, and Cora drew the Larkin pipes and played the river hymn, and Verley sat in a folding chair on the stage and listened to the organ of a town that is under a lake, and when it was done, she said, "So that's where it went. All this time, up here in the dark, singing to itself, waiting on us." And she put her hand flat on the oak of the case and left it there. The county paper ran it the next week, the front page, above the fold, a photograph of Cora standing at the console with her hand on the keys and the pipes, rising into the dark behind her. Wade Rennick read that paper on a Wednesday morning. He called a lawyer on Wednesday afternoon. The filing came 11 days later, and it was, Sam Pruitt said, reading it in his office with his glasses down his nose, about what you would expect from a man who had never once in his life valued a thing he could not put a price on and sell by the pound. It made two arguments. The first was that the will gave Cora the building and the lot, and a pipe organ, however it got there, was not the building and was not the lot. It was tangible personal property of the estate, chattel, no different from a truck or a set of tools, and so it fell into the residuary and was divided 3 ways, and since the widow had been so eager to tell the newspaper what it was worth, the estate would require that it be sold, dismantled if need be, and the proceeds distributed. The second was that Elias had redrawn his will 3 years before he died, at 76, leaving his widow a condemned theater and his own children a house, and that this was on its face the act of a man whose judgment had failed. A man his own son would testify had gotten strange about that building at the end, and that the whole instrument should be set aside. They wanted it both ways, which is how you can always tell. If Daddy wasn't in his right mind, the will was bad, and they took it all. If the will was good, the organ was chattel, and they took that. Either road ran through Cora. She read it twice, at the marble counter, and then went and sat in the front row of the dark auditorium for the better part of an hour. What rose up in her was not the flat cold clarity, but something closer to sorrow on their behalf, and under it a hard bright certainty, because Cora had spent 9 weeks reading a dead man's handwriting, and knew a thing about Elias his son had not learned in 4 years of being his boy, which was that Elias Rennick never in his life did a single thing by accident. She went and got the book, and then found Sam Pruitt and asked him whether her husband had written the will's odd wording himself, and Pruitt took off his glasses and told her a story. The hearing was in December, in the old courthouse on the square, in a room with steam radiators that knocked. It was set for a morning. It went 2 days, because the county came. Sam Pruitt went first, and Sam Pruitt was not a dramatic man, and that is exactly why it landed. He testified that Elias had come into his office 3 years back and told him what he wanted, and had not asked his advice about any part of it. He had drafted the Opera House clause the ordinary way, the building and its contents, which is how you write it, which is how he had written it 400 times. And Elias had read it and put it down on the desk and said, "No, that won't hold him," meaning his son, and asked for a pencil. And in the margin, in block capitals, over his lawyer's objection that it was unnecessary and inelegant, the client had written the words he wanted, and made Pruitt put them in, and come back the following week to see that they were still there. And everything that is inside it, whatever it may turn out to be. Pruitt laid the marked-up draft on the clerk's table. He said, in his flat way, that a man does not write a sentence like that and come back to check on it, unless he knows exactly what is inside the building and exactly which of his heirs is going to pretend it is a truck. Wade's lawyer objected. He was overruled. Roy Denny testified in the afternoon, in a clean shirt, badly, unable to be got to say more than a dozen words at a stretch. Wade's lawyer asked whether he had any personal knowledge of Elias Rennick's state of mind, and Roy thought about it a good while, the way he thought about everything, and said, "Well, he ran a cord off my back panel 30 years to give that organ wind, and he tuned it in the dark where nobody would ever see it or hear it but him, for no money and no thanks and no audience, because it was worth doing. You want to tell me that's a man who didn't know his own mind? Mister, that's the soundest man I ever stood next to." The lawyer said that was not responsive. Roy said, "You asked." Dr. Vogel testified on the second morning with a folder, and it took her 20 minutes to take the capacity argument apart, and she did it without once raising her voice. She explained to a courtroom in Cordell, Ohio, what it takes to keep a pipe organ alive, the wind and the leather and the damp and the slow lead death of neglected pipes, and every farmer and shop clerk on those benches understood it, because they all knew what a barn does when you stop keeping it. And then, she said that maintaining an instrument of this size in tune, continuously, for 30 years without a single lapse was not the act of a mind that had failed. It was a monthly act of judgment and skill and will, performed correctly better than 300 times. Then she said, "Counsel argues that his father did not know what he was doing. His father knew what he was doing every month for 30 years, well enough that a conservatory would hire him if he were alive to be hired. I would ask the court to consider which of these two men has shown the sounder plan." And Verlicade testified last, because Josie asked her to and because Cora asked her to, and she took a long time getting to the chair, and she did not talk about the will at all. She said she was 84. She said she was born in a town that is under a lake, that there is a boat ramp on top of her whole childhood, and a sign that gives the depth of the water and not one word about the people. And she had spent 50 years telling grandchildren about a place they had every right to think she had invented. When the water came, they told the people of Amsden that nothing of value would be lost. Then she said, "That man saved the only thing they didn't take from us. He kept our church singing in a room for 30 years so an old woman could hear it one more time before she goes where the rest of Amsden went. And these people want to sell it by the pound. You can put a price on it if you like. Somebody will pay it, but you had better understand what it is you are selling, because it is not a machine. It is the last voice of a town, and there are not many of us left who remember it had one." The radiators knocked. Nobody in the room moved, and Loretta Rennick Coyle, who had signed on to her brother's filing because it was easier than the telephone call it would have taken not to, and who had sat 2 days behind him with her hands folded in her lap, stood up in the middle of a hearing she was a petitioner in, and said to the judge, in a voice that came out wrong, that she wished to withdraw her name from it. Wade turned around and looked at his sister. And Loretta said the truest thing anybody said in those 2 days, and she said it to her brother, and not to the court. She said, "Wade, he left it to her because she is the only one of us who was ever going to go and look." The judge took it under advisement, which is what a judge says when he already knows. The recital was Josie's doing, and it happened on a Saturday in April, on the first warm evening of the year, and Cora did not have to do a thing but say yes. Dr. Vogel came down 3 weekends running and went through it rank by rank with Cora holding the light, and on the third pronounced it sound. And Roy Denny and 2 men from the volunteer fire department and Josie's whole chorus spent a month carrying 60 years of ruin out of the auditorium and pulling the canvas off the seats. and did not fix the plaster and did not touch the boarded windows, because there was no money and no time, but they got 400 seats clean and 100 chairs set in the aisles. They expected the churches to come. They did not expect the county. They came down Water Street from 6 o'clock on and filled 400 seats and 100 chairs, and stood along the back wall and sat on the lobby stairs where the plaster was still down. People who had driven up from Chillicothe and over from Columbus because a cousin had called. And Verlie Cade sat in the front row in a good coat with 11 of her family around her, and at a little past 8, when the last light went out of the boarded windows, a 71-year-old woman came out onto the stage of a theater that had been dark for 50 years and did not make a speech, because Cora Rennick had never in her life made a speech, and sat down on her husband's bench and raised the wind, and drew the Larkin pipes, and played Shall We Gather at the River, and the sound her grandfather gave a drowned church the year his wife died went up off the stage and out over 1,000 people, and filled, for the first time in 50 years, every corner of the room the opera house was built to fill. Cordell sat in the half-dark and listened to itself. She played the hymns of the dead churches, one after another, the Baptist ones and the Lutheran ones, and the shape-note tunes from the Little Aim Church whose voice was in the swell, and the old people mouthed the words. And when she came again to the river hymn, the whole room was singing it, 1,000 people who had come to hear a machine, and found instead that they were the instrument, and Verlie Cade stood up in the front row, with her family holding her, and sang the song of Amsden in the voice of Amsden, until it was done. The judge was in the 9th row. Nobody had asked him to come. He ruled 9 days later, and it was 3 pages, and the operative part of it was 1 sentence, that the testator had written the words, whatever it may turn out to be, into his own instrument, in his own hand, over the objection of his own lawyer, for the plain purpose of foreclosing this exact argument, and that the court would not permit itself to be the tool by which a man's clearest intention was defeated by the one error he had written those words to defeat. The rest came after, and it is the smallest part of this story, and Cora would tell you so herself. A preservation trust made the building safe, the roof was closed, and the windows unboarded, and the plaster patched, though Cora kept them from prettying it up past what it wanted to be. The conservatory took the Volmer into a registry of protected instruments, so it could never be sold, or dismantled, or taken out of the valley, which was all Cora had wanted from the law, and more than it usually gives. The Organ Society holds a convention there now, and organists drive in from 3 states to play the Drowned Church of Amsden, and the money goes to the building and the instrument and never once into Cora's account, because she did not want it, and said so. Wade came to the opera house once, that summer, alone in the evening. He stood in the alley a long while before he came in. He did not apologize, because he was not a man who could get his mouth around the word, and Cora did not require it, because she had spent 30 years around men like that, and knew that what they bring you instead of the words is the only apology they have. What Wade brought was a photograph out of his wallet, soft at the corners, of a boy of 10 at an organ bench with a man's hand over his on the keys. And he held it out and said, "He taught me the first 3 notes of that hymn, and then my mother left, and we moved to town. And he never taught me the 4th. Cora looked at it a while. Then she said, "Well, come up on the bench then. I'll show you the 4th. She still lives there." There is a proper apartment behind the box office now, and a little brass plate by the stage door that gives the name of the drowned town and the name of a man who gave a rank of pipes the year his wife died, and no other names, because Cora would not let them put hers or Elias's on it. They give recitals in the summer, and the county comes. Roy Denny still lets the cord run off his back panel, out of habit, though the building has its own power now, and refuses every offer to be paid back for 30 years of it. And once a year, on the first cold evening of the fall, when the leaves are down, and the reservoir lies flat and gray over the bottom where a town used to be, Cora Rennick lets herself into a theater on Water Street and climbs to the stage in the dark and turns a brass key and opens a door into a warm and oiled and singing room and raises the wind and draws the one stop worn smoother than all the rest, the open diapason, the center of the face, the Larkin pipes, and plays the hymn about the river alone in the dark for the drowned town of Amsden and for a man who bought her church for $45 23 years before he knew her name. And under her hands, out of pipes that were meant to lie forever under 200 feet of water, a town that is gone sings. Nothing that ever sang is gone for good. He said it once a year from the door of his shop for 28 years, and she thought he was talking about pianos. Somewhere behind you there is a person whose quiet work is still holding you up, and you have very likely never once said their name out loud to anybody. Say it now. Put it in the comments and tell us what they kept, and what it cost them, and whether they ever told you they were doing it. We read every single one. And if this one kept you company tonight, stay with us. There is another next week, told slow and told warm and told all the way to the end. Thank you for sitting through to the last of it. The sound is better back here anyway.